Hey everyone, we're back with a new story and I hope you like it. Our channel is new and I really need your support. If this video reaches 1,000 likes, I'll share even stranger and longer stories. So please press like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now let's start the story. Our story begins with a man named Juan from Mexico. After his father's death, 50 days later, he decided for the first time to visit his father's grave, which was located in the Panteón de la Paz in Mexico City. Juan says, "I left my city at 5 p.m. and arrived in Mexico City at 7 p.m. My father's grave was deep inside the cemetery, so I walked through it. It was nighttime and I used my phone's flashlight to see the path. I walked for about an hour because the graves were similar, and it was my first time visiting my father's grave. The place was dark, and after an hour of searching and going deep into the cemetery, I finally found my father's grave. I sat next to it, talked, and let out all the longing inside me. I recited prayers and stayed by the grave for about an hour. After finishing my visit, I stood up to leave the cemetery. As I was walking, I suddenly heard the sound of a child crying behind one of the graves. I was surprised and thought, could this child be alone in the cemetery? Where's his mother? I walked towards the sound of the child, and after passing the grave from which the sound was coming, I was shocked to find no child behind the grave and the sound disappeared. I stood there pondering if the sound was real or just my imagination. But soon the crying of the child interrupted my thoughts again. This time the sound was coming from one of the crypts in the cemetery. I approached the crypt, and strangely I saw the crypt's door open. I entered through the door and went down the stairs calling out, "Is anyone here?" But I heard no response, only the loud crying of the child coming from inside the crypt. When I reached the inside of the crypt, I was shocked to find a child inside. The child had dark skin and was completely naked, appearing to be about 1 year old. I approached him, wondering what brought the child here and how he could be alone without anyone around. I thought perhaps someone brought him here and abandoned him to get rid of him. The child stopped crying immediately when he saw me and just stared at me. I picked him up and held him in my arms to get out of there. Surprisingly, the child was very light compared to his size, as if I were holding a small piece of wood. I thought, let's get out of this crypt. I started to climb the stairs, but to my shock, the door was closed. I had left it open, so I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Fear crept into my heart, and I thought, oh Juan, this could be a trap. My heart started pounding faster, and I put the child down beside me to try opening the door with all my strength. The strange thing was, the door wasn't locked. It would open slightly, but then shut tight again as if someone was on the other side, holding it shut. I shouted for the person holding the door to let go, but the more I shouted, the stronger the force holding the door became. I thought, oh God, what kind of mess have I gotten myself into? Suddenly, as I was pulling on the door, I heard the child crying again. I looked beside me, but the child was gone even though I had just put him down. I heard the crying coming from deeper inside the crypt, so I rushed down the stairs and found the child in another corner of the crypt. I stood there shocked, wondering how the child got there since he couldn't walk yet. There was something strange about this child. I picked him up again and climbed the stairs to leave the crypt. This time the door was open. I thought, thank God, now I can get out. As I was about to leave, I heard a loud voice coming from inside the crypt. It was a woman's voice clearly saying, "Give me back my son. Where are you taking him? God will not forgive you." My eyes widened in shock. Could this voice be coming from inside the crypt? I had just been in there and there was no one but the graves and the dead. The woman's voice grew louder, demanding I return her son to the crypt. I descended the stairs cautiously, my heart pounding with fear. When I reached the bottom, I saw a black cloak clearly worn by a woman, but she had her back to me. I nervously said, "Is this your son?" Suddenly the cloak fell to the ground and everything vanished as if something invisible had been holding it. I was shocked with fear and started screaming. I quickly ran out of the crypt, holding the child in my arms. I closed the crypt door behind me, still in shock from what I had seen. But as soon as I got out, I realized I was lost in the cemetery. The graves were similar and some were tall, blocking my view of the city lights. It felt like the distant city had turned off all its lights. I kept walking among the graves, but it was useless. I was getting more and more lost. Then I noticed something very strange. The child I was holding seemed to get heavier and heavier, even though he had been very light, like a piece of wood. As I walked for a long time among the graves, feeling lost, I decided to sit down on one of the graves because I was very tired. I held the child in my arms as he cried loudly, trying to calm him down, but it was no use. While I was looking at the child, trying to soothe him, I raised my head and saw something behind one of the graves. I focused and saw a very shocking sight. Wide open eyes staring at me. I concentrated more and saw a woman wearing a cloak, her face black, staring at me. I stood up immediately and shouted, "Who are you? Is this your child?" But she didn't respond and just kept looking at me. I placed the child on the grave and approached the woman, but she quickly disappeared behind the grave. When I reached the grave and looked behind it, she was gone. She had just been there. I returned to pick up the child and leave the cemetery, but when I turned to the grave where I had left him, he was gone. I thought, oh God, how will this night end? What is this child? Then I heard a faint sound of laughter coming from behind the grave where I had left him. I walked over and looked behind the grave, and to my shock, I saw the child holding a severed, decayed human hand, playing with it and laughing. The smell coming from the decayed hand was awful. I picked up the child quickly, removed the severed hand from him, and continued walking with him. The more I walked, the more lost I became in the cemetery. The strange thing was, I kept hearing whispers and laughter coming from the graves, and the situation was getting worse. What were these strange sounds? The child in my arms was completely silent while the voices around us kept increasing. And what was even stranger was that every now and then I would see, at a distance between the graves, a woman wearing a cloak with her back turned towards me. Each time I saw her, I immediately looked away because her appearance was terrifying and eerie. Strangely, the child kept getting heavier in my arms. Suddenly, everything went silent in the cemetery and the sounds disappeared, but the child became unbearably heavy. I looked at the child in astonishment and was shocked to see him laughing with a very frightening and harsh voice. His mouth was extremely wide with many teeth. I was horrified by his appearance, and his laughter grew louder as if he was mocking me. His eyes turned red and his laughter intensified. I realized this child was not ordinary. His features had changed to something terrifying and angry, as if he were a child from another world. In a moment of silence, the child said in a rough voice, "You came here and you will not leave." Out of shock, I immediately dropped him from my arms, but the strange thing was that the child clung to me tightly, gripping me firmly. I tried to shake him off, but he was 1,000 times stronger than me. He kept holding on and laughing, his face no longer human. Suddenly, I heard loud screaming behind me. I turned around and saw 4 women wearing cloaks with black faces, all looking identical, running towards me at an incredible speed, screaming loudly. Out of sheer terror, I started running and screaming, but they kept chasing me, and the child was still holding on to me, laughing. It was a nightmare, and I felt like I was in a surreal dream. Every time I looked back, I saw them getting closer with their terrifying faces. I realized that what was holding on to me was not human, but a jinn from another world. I kept hitting the jinn to make him let go, but it was useless. Suddenly, as I was running, I saw a light in the distance. I ran towards it as fast as I could until I reached it. I saw an elderly man holding a flashlight. As soon as I reached him, I wanted to speak, but I couldn't, as if my tongue was cut off. However, the man seemed to understand the situation. He immediately said, "These are jinns living in this part of the cemetery. They always block the path of those who come here, especially at night. If you have a loved one buried here, it's better to visit in the morning." The man was an old grave digger in this place, and it seemed that God had sent him to save me from these jinns. Finally, I was free from them and left the cemetery, returning home safely. To this day, the experience never leaves my mind. And that's the end of the story. All right, everyone, we've reached the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and it met your expectations. If you liked it, please press like and subscribe to the channel.